So welcome to the next part of this day. We're going to have a panel of industry experts, and rather than have them introduce themselves with their names, we've put their pictures up here and their affiliations. And for those of us that have been producing PhD students, they're unbelievably drawn to go into industry rather than into academia right now. And the draw really, I think, for those of us in the machine learning world, data mining world, is the fact that they're going to work on huge data sets, and this is going to lead to interesting new algorithms and discoveries. And what I'd like to start with, and perhaps we'll start with you, Gideon, because you're nearest to me. I thought about starting at the other end, but I'll start here. I'd like you to sort of introduce yourself in a way where you explain what are the interesting things that you're doing in your particular industry because of all of the data that you have. And this could be touching on anything from what you've been able to invent because you have access to big data, what important problems that you've solved from your perspective. And the last thing in this multi-part question is if you could touch upon collaborations with other sort of industry or government partners that make the data bigger, and if you don't, I'd like to hear that as well. Was that complicated enough? So basically say whatever you want. You can,
Yes,
you can go anywhere you want with that.
I took notes and I ended up with a
And by the way, I'd like you to restrict your comments to 3 minutes.
Thank you. So thank you for having us today. So Bloomberg is a finance company, it's a media company, it's a technology company. Overall, we have about 4,000 programmers. And so dealing with data, big data, medium-sized data, and data science has always been core to our mission, which has been to bring transparency to the markets by equaling the level of information. So when I think about the information that we deal with as a company in the context of big data, there are a few different kinds of aspects I'd want to talk about. One is simply financial analytics. One of our key financial analytics products is the Port product, which does portfolio analytics, backtesting, scenario analysis. One of the reasons that it's been so successful has been it's been very, very aggressive in reaching out to the open source community and looking at everything that's evolved there and bringing it in. And I think one of the things that when I think about how industry and academia and government could all interact is through the medium of open development and open source. So as an example, in the portfolio analytics platform, they're very early adopters of Hadoop, of HBase, and now are starting to explore Spark. Spark, of course, came out of the AMP lab out of UC Berkeley, which was heavily funded by the government and incubated in academia. And once it started to transform into industry, it had a huge, huge impact. So that's one category of big data. There's another category of news and news analytics and news analysis. So as Bloomberg, of course, is a news originator, but it's also a news aggregator and a synthesizer. And so overall, we have about, I think the number is about 1.5 million news articles that come through our service every day. And our goal as a company is to make that information as useful as possible to our clients. So one of the frontiers for us in thinking about applying data science to this big data in terms of all the 3 V's, as Michael just spoke about, is how do we make these 1.5 million articles personal, relevant, synthesized, and highlighted for our users who are making very complicated decisions under huge time pressure, which actually, when you think of it, is not so different from what intelligent analysts might be working on and the scenario they might be working with. There's a huge amount of data, they have to make rapid decisions. And so in that kind of a context, the problems I think our users face are very much the same as are faced across a lot of areas of the government. I don't know, is that about 3 minutes?
About, Claudia.
So I get the same questions?
You have the open mic to kind of say whatever you want within the large framework I gave you.
So I work in display advertising, so I'm one of the cases previously mentioned as trying to establish whether or not you're into opera, and often we get it wrong, and that's okay. I never anticipated to work in advertising. I mean, I grew up in East Germany. I hadn't seen an app until I was like 15. And why did I end up here coming out of IBM Watson Research Lab? And it's really to your point. This is where the data is. There is so much data, and it's a huge playground. I actually appreciate the fact that I can get it wrong that you go to the opera. I can sleep very well at night. But it's a great playground to explore the methodologies that are available. For instance, causal inference from observational data. Can we assess whether what we do has the impact we wish or not? It's a great thing to explore in advertising, because that A is a relevant question and you get all the data to do that, and whatever we learn about what works and doesn't can then be applied, be published these into medical research and other areas where you can't quite experiment at liberty to the extent you can in advertising. So how do we work? There was another question with organizations. There's a whole industry about facilitating data exchange for advertising. It might be actually the best facility. We need your data. Crux it is. Crux will make it happen that I can get you my data and you can give me your data. I need data from Time Inc. Well, then it's BlueKai. So there are many, many service providers whose job it is nothing else but establishing the identity of individuals with some probability. Again, we don't get this right all the time. And provide the ability to connect these data sets together. And that's really where a lot of the shopping behavior, your physical locations, the places you go to, gets pulled in to connect to what do you do online and so on. Probably, again, very similar to what the security community is trying to do as well, except we hire people to do the matching for us.
You need a mic.
So I sent one slide, contrary to your instructions. Is it possible to flash that up? I sent it in. Thank you. All right. So I work in healthcare. I'm the national leader for I'm a partner in KPMG. And I'm the national leader of the healthcare and life sciences data analytics practice. So most of you go KPMG, that's an audit company. What the heck are they doing with healthcare and all that? Well, it turns out we're an audit company, but we're also a consulting company, right? And I'm going to start by describing our view of healthcare, which, as you know, has several unique challenges when it comes to data. Notably, patient privacy is one of those, and vast complications in the fact that medical data is different. People store information differently. The same term means different things at different hospitals, sometimes in the same hospital. But leaving that aside, if you take the macro view of healthcare, there is a trend which we call convergence. Convergence means that initially, healthcare has always been filled with silos. You have providers, which are doctors, hospitals. You have payers, the insurance company, they have their own data. You have life sciences, pharma company, which has the data for clinical trials, market efficacy studies, et cetera. You have intermediaries, such as CROs like Quintiles, and your PBMs like CVS, your pharmacy benefit managers. And then you have new entrants, all private equity, all the people coming in. Let's figure out how to take data from Jawbone or Fitbit and integrate it. Every healthcare startup that's starting up. Genomics, certainly you can include it in the mainframe, but we've still not got to the point where personalized medicine is ubiquitous. It's starting to make strides. So these are starting to converge. You're already seeing this in the provider-payer space, where the lines are getting blurred, where because of the new legislation, providers are taking on more risk. And all this is happening because of three major factors. The first is economics. We have come to the realization that 15% of our GDP, 17, 19, 21, 25, at some point, we have to stop spending more money on healthcare, regardless of which side of the aisle you sit on. Now, whatever your opinion is about the specific regulations, whether you think Obamacare is wonderful or whether you think it's horrible, there is a trend, it's called the volume to value, where we're going to change care from being based on the number of times you treat a patient to what the outcomes is, outcomes-based care. And legislation that's basically affecting reimbursement for providers, for pharma companies, outcomes-based reimbursement for new drugs, et cetera, is starting to drive that convergence, to force people to share the data. And the final thing is consumerism. These things weren't around 10 years from now. So patients now go up and say, here are 27 clinical trials I found on the web doc. Which one should I be on? or they say, I want my data. There's just an increasing demand. So this is forcing this convergence. And none of this would be possible without the fourth trend, which is the advances in big data that make it possible to take disparate kinds of data. If there's one thing that companies like Google and Bing and Yahoo have shown us, is that you can take the most disorganized, the most disparate piece of data, the internet, which is what, half pictures of a dubious nature? The other half is propaganda, lies, mistruth, and yet, it is the single greatest resource to mankind today, because we are able to take all of it, and we are able to mine it and extract the few pieces of information. Healthcare will eventually move there because it will have to because of economics. That's why we think big data and the ability is going to be critical. I'm going to take a minute more and just talk about a collaboration. I saw the glare, so I'm going to look that way. So you asked about data. Well, we've purchased access to data. We have data for 140 million patients, all their data. But I'm going to talk about a project here right in the state of New York. We are working with the state of New York to help them implement the DSRIP program. DSRIP is an $8 billion with a B dollar project over 5 years to help change the way healthcare is driven to Medicaid patients, the poorest, most wretched group of patients in the US, by improving outcomes. And we are, my team, part of my team, is helping the state in a large funded project, almost $100 million, to help them roll this out over the first 3 years in terms of deciding what data to collect, how do you coordinate care across multiple institutions, what should the right incentives be. So that's a perfect example, right? I mean, it's okay, it's 6 million patients, but that's a reasonable amount of data. And figuring out how to use that in working with different is a perfect example of how you can use big data to have tremendous impact.
Thank you. I work at Google, and we have a lot of big data. And one of our mindsets is to just constantly ask the why not question. And I decided to use as an example in my 3 minutes Google Maps. So this started with the idea of why not just give people access to map data for free and see what kinds of cool things might derive from that. And one of the things that I'm not sure anyone was expecting, but I don't know, I didn't work there at the time, was we get live traffic monitoring. Because people have cell phones, and we can figure out where the cell phones are and how fast they're moving and where the density is. And growing up in New York City, I can tell you that before that, you used to have to listen to AM radio. And you would hear this guy go,
You're just rushing your business. 10 minutes on the exit on the left lane and the BQE is running out to exit 5. Stay on the left lane there. But the next traffic update in 10 minutes.
and you're like, what about, which way should I go? So, this really changed things. And what changed things was having all of this data. And when I started working at Google, one of the things that someone said to me that really stuck in my head was, think about the numbers. There are 60 trillion web pages. Google gets 6 billion queries a day. So if you're working in the query space and you have a piece of code that has a 1 in a million chance of failure, do the math. That's how many times it's going to fail per day. So if you have like a log message that buzzes your cell phone every time your code crashes, it's just going to be one continuous buzz throughout the day. So I say that because one of the values that I think we can really get out of this is we really need people that understand how to think that way. It's not just the coolness of big data, but it's the way dealing with things at that kind of scale twists the way you have to think. You have to be prepared not just to have cool ideas and come up with new algorithms, but you have to be prepared from the start to think about the failure rate, how serious failure is, and so forth. And we need people like that.
So I work at RELX. Elsevier is part of RELX. We're a digital solutions provider for professionals, so lawyers, scientists, medical professionals. And I wanted to give you kind of two examples of how we use data. One kind of a more mature business that we have. So every time you go and call Geico for your new car insurance, that will check with one of our products about all the claims you've had in the past. And so that'll approve or disapprove and help decide what kind of insurance you're going to get. And that involves essentially mass scale disambiguation of people over hundreds of millions of people, so essentially the entire United States if you're a car driver. And that's really a core part of one of our businesses, and that's been pretty long established, again, based on big data. On the Elsevier side, we have some new things coming up in terms of how we support people like you, or people like me, scientists. We have kind of a really old thing we do in science called publish papers. So how can we make that more efficient? And one of the things we've been doing is developing numbers of recommenders across different kinds of signals, not just citations, but how people read on something like Mendeley, how people talk about things in social media, how people interrelate in social networks to give you better recommendations for that. And that's all driven by all this data coming in. And I think one of the things, I joined Elsevier about a year ago now, and just as somebody who went from academia to industry, it's been really, really fun, coming back to Chris's points, being able to play with all that data in actually a Spark environment. And so I think that kind of fun is something we have in industry, and we should work on how we can do that, bring that to academics as well.
Well, you all are a tough act to follow. Carla, I thought if I picked a single example, or even two examples, it would be a little bit misleading about the kind of data that we deal with at Yahoo, because one of the crucial characteristics of our lives every day is heterogeneity. So we have enormous data sets, ongoing collection of data in terms of images, video, natural language, text, either generated by professionals like at Bloomberg or by more than 1 billion users. We have mail, incredible amounts of mail, and one of our biggest and most important businesses is fantasy football. So the variety of what we have to deal with is amongst our biggest challenges, because the integration of understanding of what our users want and care about across those many modalities is crucial to providing the kind of personalized recommendation services that keeps us in business. On top of it, you sort of asked, what are the things you do that matter? In some respects, we don't even have a business without data. In some regards, just like Google and others, we depend on advertising revenue. And while, with all due respect to Mike, he said that, you know, if you miss a few ads here and there, it's not a big deal. The fact is, it is for us, and I'm sure for some of our colleagues. And so ideas like taking an incredibly rapid, large set of pipes of data coming in constantly and turning that into highly accurate predictive understanding about who will click what, where people will go next, what they care about, what they don't want to ever see again, is absolutely fundamental to our business. Without it, we don't have one. So we have enough data coming in, again, probably similar to Google and some others, that the data is so big we can't store it. So there's a kind of a sense people have about big data is it's in some gigantic set of replicated databases around the world. Well, our stuff can't even be kept. So the question is, when it comes in at the speed and scale at which we get it, what do you do with it? Do you do analysis instantaneously and store summaries? How do you, as was mentioned earlier, use data you've already seen, but you've lost the raw data to sort of predict future events or recognize, in our case, not threats, but opportunities that are coming that you didn't anticipate in advance. So I don't know the number of petabytes that we have and the number of terabytes that come in every day, but it's large. And it really changes the game when you know stuff is going to be flying by and you don't have a chance to go back and get it again. The things that we care about are pretty obvious. We clearly care about prediction of things like clicks. In many instances. I mentioned fantasy football. Certainly it matters how many people are picking the same player if you're playing a daily game, because there's a lot of money at stake. Recommendation is really crucial to our business. In running our systems along the lines that Chris mentioned, we need to deal with anomaly detection at very, very large scale, dealing with time series data. The kind of machine learning we're doing is outrageously complex because it involves, as I mentioned, heterogeneous data coming from different sources at very high speed and outrageously large scale. Amongst all the things that have been mentioned today, one of the things that's most important to us is the preservation of users' privacy. So what do you retain, what do you reveal, what do you merge with other data, both internal, external, all while preserving privacy and making what data you have on each user transparent to the user is just absolutely critical, and there's a huge amount of research that still needs to be done there. One last point, we're smaller than some other companies, and so we can't fund academia quite at the level that I used to be able to do at DARPA, which is sad, but true. But we have a lot of relationships across at least the United States and to some extent outside with academia, in ways that generally deal with a small amount of money, but probably dealing with a more valuable commodity, which is access to our data. And we've worked out small funding agreements where faculty members and universities can sign pretty unconstrained agreements, not quite where they're comfortable and we're comfortable. And at least 7 or 8 years ago, we created a program that we call WebScope, for sharing real-world data sets, appropriately anonymized and randomized, with academia. So at this point, over the years, we've released more than 55 data sets. They're getting larger. One of our biggest is a 100 million Flickr image data set under a Creative Commons license. We've got a huge amount of Yahoo Answers data out there. Somebody told me the other day that at least 5,700 citations in Google Scholar refer to this Yahoo Answers data set. We've gotten our data sets out to at least 6,000 faculty around the world, 1,000 institutions. Coming in January, I won't give you details yet, but soon, we are expecting to release what will probably be the largest machine learning-oriented data set ever released from industry, and the size, even to me, is pretty staggering. So one of the ways we feel like we can contribute to the community and work with people outside of our own company and even outside of industry is through the sharing of data, all the while protecting our users.
So, Ron, that was actually an incredible lead-in to the next small set of questions that I want to ask the panel, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. And, ultimately, why are we all here today? We're here to create partnerships to solve really challenging problems, and also to think about how we can partner across academia, government, nonprofits, and industry. And so I'm not going to ask Ron this because he's already answered that question. And I'm just going to pick 2 people for each of the questions to get 2 perspectives, and it's somewhat of a random pick for each of the questions. But I want to start with, well, first I'd just like a show of hands of the rest of the panel of whether you feel like your industry is able to even think about the process that you would need to put forward to share data the way that Yahoo is sharing it. And I'd like to ask in particular, and I'll start with Gideon, and then I'd like Bharat to answer this as well, what would it take? Are you doing it at this level, and what would it take to get it at that level so that it's true academics are, we want your data? You need the mic.
Okay,
And
thank
then
you.
Bharat, I'd like you to answer the question as well.
So to think about, yes. So certainly we're thinking about. I have to say, and I personally in our group very much struggles with how do we do effective collaboration around data. Honestly, around software, it's a lot easier. But around data, it's much more difficult. In part because data is so key to our business and has been so key to our business for so long. And so it gets, we get stuck into one of these catch-22 kind of situations where if we release data which is relevant to us and relevant to our users, then that's a potential loss for our business. But if we release data which is irrelevant, then there's not really a whole lot of point. So I think it's been, we've been trying to navigate that question. I don't think we have a good answer. One thing that has been successful is we've brought people in to work at Bloomberg on a postdoc or a sabbatical kind of a basis. We have Mark Dredzy here from JHU. That has been very effective. Once you're inside, you have a very large remit, and you have kind of the ability to operate very, I don't want to say entirely freely, but somewhat freely, and kind of explore in that way. But I guess one other aspect that Ron touched on very briefly, but I'll put my chips in too, is how do you effectively preserve user privacy, but also enable the kind of recommendation and sharing that you want to allow. And again, I would completely agree. I would love to have more theory around differential privacy and around sharing in order that I could then use in order to build algorithms and build tools and build more services for our clients and still be able to say very, very concretely that don't worry, these are the guarantees that we have to assure you that no private data that you have, which to our clients is very, very sensitive, is being released.
Barrett, do you want to?
Just checking to see if I can mention the name of the. Nope, no press release yet. So, sorry. I'm just trying to check something. So healthcare.
Mike.
Healthcare, there's an obvious problem, right? I'm not legally allowed to share data. I mean, I'm sometimes not legally allowed to look at the data myself while we're working on it, right? It's got to be sequestered, and access has got to be. And part of this is just, you know, as an audit company which has to keep, you know, not just be unbiased, but, you know, professional reputation, integrity is important. Any sort of data breach would be disastrous. So the restrictions we have in place in terms of protecting our clients' data and sharing it are just very, very difficult. Now, that said, we are collaborating specifically with government, you know, very often. So we're working with the Center of Medicare and Medicaid Services, and we have data, and, you know, we make it available. It's their data, but we're storing it, and then there are other collaborators, and sometimes the other collaborators are universities, right? I mean, sometimes we do joint, grants together with, apply for grants together with universities. That's one mechanism in the healthcare space to make it possible. It's just very hard to put healthcare data available. But I'm going to talk about another problem, and that's what I was looking. One of the major professional sports, there are only 4 of them in the US, we are doing their schedule, right? So at some point when the press release comes out, you know, we do hundreds of billions of simulation runs to, you know, and the constraints are terrible. You know, you could imagine what it is depending on the sport, right? I mean, I'm not going to mention the constraints because then you'll know which sport it is. But it's one of the 4 major sports, and we're talking to another one. That's data which could very easily be made available. I'm also going to talk about one particular example in my previous life when I was in Siemens, where in fact we did collaborate very successfully with academia, and it was with DARPA. It was part of a panel where we funded 10 projects in healthcare. And one of the things with then DARPA and now NSF is, if you look at all of us, the problems we work on, maybe Google X is different, but the problems we work on are the problems we face today as a business, right? And one could argue that the purpose of NSF is to look at sort of the problems we'd face tomorrow. So an example of a project that was funded, and we provided some grad student funding to it and other did, was we said, come up with a new kind of ultrasound. That was just, you know, the project, the NSF, the DARPA project. And the work that was done resulted in 3D ultrasound, which is going to be the new kind of, you know, companies are doing that. So it may well be possible in this space particularly that if we get data that we sort of start to look at problems that aren't immediate, the ones we are solving today, but the ones we'd be interested in having solved tomorrow. And that might be an approach where, you know, a relatively small amount of funding, a few grad students, you could start to bend the curve.
Wonderful. I'd like the next question, I'd like Chris and Ron to answer this. Both Google and Yahoo have been had a very good relationship with academia, both with data and with funding, with bringing in academics on sabbatical. Sometimes Google then keeps them, which doesn't always make us happy, but that's okay. And I'd like to sort of to hear your perspective on what's really worked for you for that, and what's been the barrier, and how can we as a group try to unwind some of the existing barriers. I know barriers in a lot of universities, there's this IP thing, and some universities get it and some don't. But I'd love to hear your perspectives on what should we do next, what's worked, where are we going? Chris, do you want to start?
I mean, I'll just repeat what I said. I think it's really important for people to come up to speed in in doing useful and productive things, even for themselves in our environment, is just getting used to the idea of dealing with a gigantic scale of data and understanding that it's not just a clever idea that's going to work, but you have to do some serious engineering. And the two have to go together. There's just no way around it. So that's why I was saying I think the value of sharing data, like Ron announced, having a center like this to give people exposure to really the engineering requirements to do good science, just will make it easier for them to be productive in what, unless we steal them, is going to be a short period of time.
Carla, as I've mentioned, we've been doing this for quite a few years, and I guess honestly the biggest barrier we had was convincing our management that there would not be damage done, trying to build very substantial relationships with academia around data and around sabbaticals and internships and the like. And once that logjam was broken, and we can talk a little bit about how we did it, once we got rolling, we've been fine. So sabbaticals, internships, this data sharing program, our faculty grant program, all these things are now just normal part of business for us that we repeat every year. And so we don't get repeated resistance because in some sense we've already set the precedent. Amongst the things that we needed to do at the beginning were to find data sets internally that it would be kind of a no-brainer that they could cause no harm to the business. So frankly, the original data set started out by being very old. And many of our businesses depend on timely data, and once data is 5 years old or 3 years old, or in some case 10 minutes old, it's no longer of any value. And once we could show our leadership that that was the case, that was an important element. Secondly, we worked very hard from a technical point of view on, I guess, what you would loosely call anonymization techniques and using techniques from the literature. And this is still open, but we've gotten somewhere. We've done some randomization. And then we had to form a team internally that involved not only technical people from our research organization, but the legal organization, what we call our ethics and compliance office. We have a data governance board. They got involved. And once we set up a process whereby very close evaluation of the data to be released could be done, and everybody signed off, the rest of the company was okay with it. So there are things that we've done in terms of transforming data, using older data, using, frankly, only partial data, which is still going to be valuable to academics if you're not cutting out the most crucial ingredients. All of those things helped us get over the initial hump. Then in terms of working with the universities, obviously we have non-disclosure issues. When somebody comes to visit, if they become an employee or a consultant, they have to sign an agreement, and it's usually not very onerous, and it's very commonsensical, right? No one would expect to come inside and work with data that reveals things about users and then go publish that data. Just nobody really wants to push that. They sign an agreement to that effect. And then on the IP issues, you may be aware that we have a very large partnership we set up last year or 2 years ago with Carnegie Mellon, which is kind of unusual and very specific. That took many, many, many months to negotiate, and both sides had their lines that they didn't want to cross. And I have to say, our attorneys came through and relaxed on some crucial criteria that made it acceptable for our academic partners. And so it wasn't just butting heads indefinitely. And now, of course, again, that sets a precedent for us internally. And so, and I'm happy to share some of the details kind of offline with colleagues. So I guess back to the original point, and the first thing I said is the major impediment for us was really getting an internal comfort level with letting outsiders in under protected circumstances and showing that the value to be gotten for that far outweighed the risk.
That's great. As the child of 2 lawyers, I feel your pain. I'm going to ask one more question of Claudia and Paul, and then I want to open it up to the audience. So while you're thinking of questions, try to choose 1 or 2 people to address your questions to. And if they want to punt and give it to somebody else, that's fine. But I find panels where every single person answers the question to be less invigorating than ones where you think of a specific person. So my last question is kind of a tough one. And I've saved it for you, Claudia and Paul. You know, what is your vision of the future in terms of solving some of the large problems that Kathy outlined, or the large domain areas? So we want to bring together the best research when you're trying to solve a real problem in the real world is to bring together the domain scientists, the data, and you know, the machine learning, data mining, big data people that can solve it. And so what is your view? If we could get around the IP issues and we could figure out how to share data from industry and government with academia, if we could follow the template that Ron worked out with CMU, what's your vision of, if this is a major success, how would that impact your company? Not research in general, but your company. And Claudia's looking like she wants Paul to answer first with her facial expression. But either one of you can take that first.
So, I mean, my life exists on many planes, and I will actually punt on the my company part and refer to myself as I work at NYU as well as I work with DataKind and many other groups and have many other data-related hobbies. What I think fits your question and what is a little bit beyond what this group of people has done, I think we're actually not doing that badly when it comes to the Yahoos and the Googles and the Facebooks and how they work with academia. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I do see an incredible amount of really cool stuff being done in these places and academia being involved. What I want to challenge and what my vision is and what I want to see where we can go, there's a much broader, almost democratic, there's a universe of data people out there that are actually not in those places. And they want to be part of something too. And there are a lot of people who have really hard problems, whether these are the nonprofits like Water, like many of those, they are struggling on a completely different level. And I wish to argue as much as the big companies can push major societal problems forward, there are a host of small players who want to be part of, who can make a difference, who can make a big difference. And one of the challenges that I want to also pose back to the hub is, how do we become inclusive and not ignore those groups as well? How can we do and to me it's a matching problem. I clearly see it as a matching problem. There are a lot of problems, there are a lot of companies with problems that are important they can't fix. There are a lot of people who would love to donate their time to advance their understanding, their careers. And DataKind is one of them, trying to do the matchmaking. They don't have the funds to scale it. So my vision for the future is, can we go beyond aligning Google with Cornell into making this a much larger societal effort where we bring in all the players who want to be part of it? And it's not going to impact my immediate career, but it's still all of my hobbies. I think very much I'm interested in see where this goes.
Yeah, so I want to focus on the change in how we do science, right? All of you are scientists, and really, if we look to many of the people, we have really great relationships with what I'll call domain scientists, i.e. everybody who's not a computer scientist. And we also have really great relationships with computer scientists. But what we see more and more is that our domain scientists, whether they be in physics or oceanography or medicine, really need to partner with computer scientists. And it kind of comes back to this matchmaking idea. We need those groups of people, and that's something where I think BD Hub could help, to come together and talk to us on a one-on-one basis, because we really believe we can accelerate that process of science. So I'll give you one example. We're part of a program with DARPA called Big Mechanism, where we're looking at reading the scientific literature to help do causal discovery of new ways of doing cancer pathways. And that's a combination of top computer scientists, us providing kind of data, and also really good domain scientists brought together. And so if we can make those channels, if we can bring those kinds of scientists together, I think we can do a lot more.
So I'd like to open it up to the audience, and the mic will travel to you unless you have a booming, booming voice.
So interestingly, my question is almost maybe where you left off. My concern is in the life sciences. I go across the country, and so one of the basic needs is that life scientists all over now need to become data scientists in order to analyze and look at it. And it's really interesting because they not only passively gather data, but then of course they do experiments, so they're actively generating data. But then they now need to understand what are the tools I need to analyze these data, and they don't know what those tools are. And the word that I heard a couple of times before was, sort of recommendation. And I wonder if there's not something to learn from industry, in the sense of how do we take advantage of not just sharing data, but how can we get life scientists who are now trying to tackle these new problems to actually know and be recommended these are the tools, or these are the algorithms that work. These are the types of things, not just the data sharing, but the methods sharing for people who are not coming from those universes. So I'm curious what we can learn from industry and how might there be collaborations, because on one level it's also, I'm not concerned about the person who's assembling genomes at Broad Institute. I'm also concerned at the person who is at a community college who now can afford these sequencers, because every one of them are sitting on the potential to generate tremendous data, but it's not only generating that data, they also, in large part, will be the first people to analyze it, and they don't know how to get started. So what do you folks think? I was thinking about Paul and Claudia also, because I wondered, again, how do we get those recommendations, not just for the data, but for the methods?
So I'll just give you a point, kind of an evidence point for what you're saying. One of the top things that we know that people search for are methods. And so providing not only the normal methods you would use in a laboratory experiment, but really good computational methods, surfacing those for people looking for them, because people really do scientists search for methods. We know that. So that's the evidence of what you're saying. It's not a solution, but evidence for what you're saying.
So my quick answer to you, I don't think finding the right search key to put into Google is going to help at all, because it requires a lot of data understanding to even figure out what really the nature of the problem is to get to the point. So I would go back to, we need matches. We need to be able to find people who can help you understand what you need and teach you in the process. You were eager?
Okay, I'll break my rule.
Thank you. So it's so funny that you mentioned Broad, because in a prior life, I worked with Broad on their thinking about how to expand their platform for doing computation analysis to bench biologists. And I think that the model that they were exploring made a huge amount of sense to me, which was they had built out a general model where you could plug and play advanced methods into this platform and then do analysis on your particular data set. And one of the things that there were a few points that they emphasized in their, I was going to say in their system. One was literate programming, reproducible research, and ability to share directly in terms of this platform. And to be totally honest, one of my hopes for Elsevier was always that it would provide this platform, and that Springer would provide this platform, but that hasn't happened yet.
But we do provide some of those platforms, right? So I think we already do for research data. We have a number of I don't want to sound like a sales pitch, but we have a number of platforms for research data management, and we have numbers of journals for software and methods, those kinds of things.
I'm going to take a question from from the audience now. I know you wanted to say something, Brett, maybe you can feed it into the next question.
Well, I'm going to follow up on that theme. So I'm Azar Bistavros from Boston University, and there's interesting discussion. First, we need more data, so here's data, but this is, I don't want to give you my data. It's very difficult, et cetera, et cetera. And then, well, I have data, I just need methods. And then we search on that. I think there is a third one, and it started to come out, which is this notion of a platform. I don't give you my data, I allow you to run queries against it or services against it, and that's the idea of a platform. And I'm a systems person, so I'm going to try to sell sort of a vision of can't really think about data sort of in separation of the services I can build around it, especially with clouds and scale, and you don't want to move the data. So the point what I want to ask is, sometimes when you think about this connection between methods and data through APIs, many of the problems you talk about go away because, for example, I may do things with differential privacy or with multi-party computation, whatnot, that make some of the problems related to privacy go away, or at least easier to deal with. I'll stop here. Interesting. Well, my question is, what I heard is really, we have data or we have methods. Can you help with this? Is this a model for interaction where either you build services or you allow, for example, a project out of here to build a service to access your data so that it becomes more useful and easier for access to the rest of the community?
Do you want to take that? This may not answer your question directly, but when we were preparing and giving data sets for academic research, we started with them small enough that we could send you could actually download the data set over the net, or we got to the point where we had to ship you a hard drive. Well, our data sets now are so big that we can't do that. So in some cases, we actually provide data on AWS, Amazon's web services. Now, that's a platform in a way. It certainly makes your ability, you don't have to find a place to put our data on your computers. You don't have to figure out how to access it. It's there because you're in a computing environment. On the other hand, I'm not sure I see a way around this in the sense that we have our own internal platforms for dealing with all this data, as do our colleagues in other companies. It would take a lot of energy, time, and probably money to expose those for research. And that, frankly, I think in our environment probably would take enough away from our day-to-day business we couldn't do it. So the way we train people is by bringing them in for internships or sabbaticals or once-a-week visits and let them use our internal platforms and our data. It's not ideal. It means it's not open to everyone, but we have been able to get a sizable number of people who work at universities in to understand how to take advantage of our already existing platforms. I don't know about open sourcing them or making them available. The amount of work involved is probably prohibitive, but I could be wrong.
But would you be interested in somebody from outside doing this against your tool?
When you say doing this, you mean?
Developing services, a different platform, perhaps. In other words, you don't have to make your platform available, but instead of giving your data to everybody, you allow services to expose your data in ways you like.
Absolutely, in a certain way. So it's not exactly analogous, but it's close. The arrangement we have with Carnegie Mellon that I mentioned earlier, it's not just sharing data. It's, in fact, giving people on campus access to some of our actual product APIs and be able to build their own internal instances on campus and run them and extend them any way they want, including using their own data. They have to figure out what agreements they want to put in place for their campus people who are sharing their data. So for example, they're probably going to put a certain level of campus email in this system, so they need to deal with the same privacy issues that we do as a company, but it's not within our firewall, it's theirs, and they can extend the platform and do things with it. And obviously our fondest desire would be for them to create an extended or novel platform that then we could take back in and use for our business, and the terms of the agreement would allow them to do anything they want with it. So it's not a closed wall where we own exclusive rights to what they do. And that's one of, I think, the innovative things we managed to do in that agreement. So we would love to see it. For us, it's hard to duplicate that agreement too many places, but maybe if we make progress one at a time, or some of our analogous companies do the same thing, we can get platforms out to you.
I'm going to go to the next question, and then after that, we have another question up there, and then we're going to have to stay on time. So quick questions and quick answers.
It's going to be a very quick question. I think you answered. I'm from a nonprofit company called Concurrent Technologies. We invest in IR&D and all that, and we want to test drive it. I think you probably answered my question. You know, we're looking for somebody where we want them to look at what we did and see, no kidding, yeah, this looks good. You can come here for a week and test drive it with our data set, and I think you answered my question. That's what we're looking for.
Wonderful. So let's move really quickly to the next question. Question there in the center. Just stand up and yell.
My name is John Davis. I'm from RAND. One of the things that I'm interested in, thank you, I'll lower my voice a bit, and this I think is principally directed to Ron, is I think it would be really interesting when you start integrating data from a wide variety of sources. So data from just one company won't be as interesting as if you're getting it from multiple companies. I would imagine that there are going to be cases where a competition comes into play, so that Yahoo would be willing to give data as long as I'm not also getting data, let's say from Google, for example. Did that ever come into play in some of your arrangements where you thought about you can have access to our data as long as it's not integrated with other sources of data? Thank you.
No. It's obviously something you would think of in advance when you're doing this, but the fact is academic institutions would not really accept those kinds of constraints. It wasn't really realistic or practical. The crucial thing, I think, as we've implied earlier, and especially when we talk about privacy, is the concern about putting any data out for people to look at where it can be combined with other data sets. You have to accept that possibility, including just open source public data. And we've seen examples of this. You're all aware of the AOL data breach from a number of years ago that wasn't combining AOL with Google's data. It was AOL with publicly available data gotten elsewhere. So that's where the issue of, again, I hesitate to use the word because it's so loaded, but anonymization comes into play, and the removal of personally identifiable information, PII, and really thinking hard, doing what we used to call in the government red teaming, making sure that people who are interested in breaking down your privacy barriers or misusing your information, by and large, you have confidence that it can't be done. Once you do that to the degree we believe we've done it, and by the way, we've declined to release certain types of data sets because the risk is too high. For example, search log data, which I know many academics would dearly love to have, but that was really the guts of the AOL data problem from a number of years ago. So the hope is you can get data from lots of sources and do whatever you want with it, and it will help move the state of the art forward, and we don't feel in a position to restrict you from those kinds of combinations.
Okay, we have time for a really quick question and a one-word answer. I'm kidding.
Great. I have a question that requires only a one-word answer. My name is Amy Nernberger. I'm from Columbia University. I wanted to follow up on something that Gideon had brought up, the idea of reproducible research. And so much of reproducible research is based on data and the methods that are used to analyze it being findable, accessible, interoperable, reproducible. There are other organizations who are also working on this that are also funded by the NSF, such as the Research Data Alliance that is dedicated to removing barriers and sharing research data. Which of your companies are involved with that group? One-word answer.
You just raise your hand. One. All right. Well, on that very short, silent answer, I'd like to thank our panel.